Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in person here today at the Atlantic Council and virtually around the world for our conference titled China in the Global South, Development and Influence in a Shifting Global Order, a joint effort between the Council and the University of Notre Dame Keough School of Global Affairs as part of our China Global South initiative to better understand and respond to China's impact across the Global South. My name is Dave Shullman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which has the mission of devising allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging the Atlantic Council's work on China across our 16 programs and centers. It's a true pleasure to kick off this two-day conference on a topic that could not be more timely and which is central both to big questions around the state of the international order amidst intensifying strategic competition, as well as to the state of progress towards critical development goals across much of the world as countries look to rebound from the pandemic, address massive infrastructure financing gaps, and harness the benefits of emerging technologies. In recent years, China has devoted significant resources to deepening engagement across much of the developing world, or what these days is commonly referred to as the Global South. From the $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative to the creation of new multilateral forums, conferences, and summits, China is portraying itself as a champion of and for the Global South. And in many ways, these efforts are paying off. China is now Africa's largest trading partner and the second largest for Latin America and the Caribbean. In Africa, 53 countries have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative, with Eswatini being the only exception. There are, of course, political ramifications of deepening economic engagement. Eswatini is the only African country to officially recognize Taiwan, and since 2017, targeted BRI investments in Central America have helped entice the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua to switch diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to the PRC. We've seen a similar story play out in the Pacific Islands. 6 years ago, 6 Pacific countries recognized Taiwan, but that number has now been cut in half as China has deepened its economic and, in some cases, political and security relationships with those nations, with significant geostrategic implications. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Beijing is slowly translating mounting economic engagement into political and diplomatic influence. Last March, Beijing was credited with mediating a historic détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, potentially reshaping the region's politics. Now, even as it maintains a traditional risk-averse approach to involvement in the region, China aims to use the Israel-Hamas war and U.S. support for Israel to bolster its narratives in the region and across the developing world, narratives that question the merits of the U.S.-led global order and democratic governance, offering developing countries an alternative vision at a time when, as Xi Jinping puts it, the world is undergoing changes unseen in a century. The consequences of Beijing's increasingly close ties across these diverse regions are magnified in multilateral forums like the United Nations, where China has sought to rally Global South countries to defend its human rights record and support its efforts to transform the global order into one more suited to China's rise under the Chinese Communist Party. Over the next 2 days, we will explore China's renewed strategic focus and engagement in the Global South. But we will actually spend the bulk of our time doing something that's not done enough here in Washington, which is to take a nuanced look at developing countries' perspectives on China and whether their engagement with China is helping them to achieve ambitious development goals. We will explore what this picture looks like across varied domains, from tech innovation and digital ecosystems to investment, debt, and trade, to the rule of law and the information environment, and much more. Benefiting from the participation of experts from across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia, we will explore how relations with China are playing out across the vast and diverse regions that make up the so-called Global South. I'm thankful to those of you who have traveled long hours to join us here in Washington. In bringing together your diverse perspectives, we hope to listen and learn, exploring the circumstances in which developing countries are truly benefiting from engagement with China, what is working and why, and conversely, where are ties with China undermining countries' prosperity and sovereignty. And we will close the conference tomorrow by discussing how the United States and its allies and partners can better engage Global South countries to benefit their citizens, present viable alternatives to China's offers, and ultimately ensure that the emerging strategic competition we are witnessing across the Global South creates a more sustainable, prosperous, and secure world. So I'm truly excited about what we have in store for the next 2 days, learning from an array of experts, practitioners, and policymakers from around the world. And lastly, as the leader of a Global China Hub program here at the Atlantic Council, that leverages deep expertise on China across the Council in recognition of the fact that China's global impact across domains is now simply too pervasive to be understood without such a matrixed approach. I'm proud that we are taking full advantage of our unique collaborative model during this conference, with regional and functional experts from more than half of the Atlantic Council's centers taking part and enlightening us on everything from BRI debt restructuring to China's shaping of information ecosystems, to the adoption of Chinese technology and standards, to the export of surveillance tools in developing societies. Thank you to my colleagues from across the Council for your participation in this groundbreaking conference. A conference which, I'd like to underscore, is only possible due to the Council's partnership with Notre Dame University and with my friend and longtime collaborator, Joshua Eisenman, the co-leader of the China Global South Initiative and associate professor of politics at Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs, who I will introduce now. Dr. Joshua Eisenman's research focuses on the political economy of China's development and its foreign relations with the United States and the developing world, particularly Africa. He has been a visiting faculty member at Fudan University, Peking University, and NYU Shanghai. He was a policy analyst on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission and has been senior fellow for China Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council since 2006. Before coming to Notre Dame in 2019, he was assistant professor of public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. Josh, over to you.
Thank you, Dave. I really appreciate the introduction. It really is wonderful to be here with you today. And let me begin by saying that the China Global South Initiative, the CGSI, is really transformative in that it's bringing together a top research university at Notre Dame with all of the benefits and all of the accoutrements that come with that, with a top Washington think tank with the policy chops that Dave was mentioning in his speech. And so it really does further both of the interests of both of the institutions. And I'm really proud to work with Dave to be a part of it because it's with the CGSI that we're going to be engaging with people in this conference and going forward throughout the Global South and also working on issues in the Global South. And that's fundamental to the Keough School's ambitions going forward, as Dean Appleby will talk about in a moment. But what I want to do is just pump prime a couple of issues for us, put them on the table, and then for us to discuss later. I first want to just say it's pretty amazing here that we are talking about this in this environment, because in 2007, Ambassador Derek Mitchell and I did a book called China and the Developing World, Beijing's Strategy for the 21st Century. We could barely find a publisher, and when we did, it was a two-tone cover. I don't think we sold many of them, and this town really wasn't all that interested. So to see all the interest that has come about since is really quite fantastic. And in some ways, we owe this to Mr. Xi Jinping himself, right? That he has decided to make a change, and instead of biding and hiding, he is striving for achievements. And as part of that effort to strive for achievements, he's been engaging the Global South and the rest of the world in ways that we haven't seen before. And so a lot of this development we've seen over the last decade is because Mr. Xi Jinping made it so. And decided that he was going to strive for achievements. And it's under that rubric that we have this increasing tension developing between the United States and China, what some have called a new Cold War. So it's within this context that these middle countries, and the Global South in particular, become geostrategically important as well in ways that may be reminiscent in some ways of the way they were important during the first Cold War. However, I would like to suggest that this is a different world we live in today, right? During the first Cold War, the United States found itself in proxy wars with the Soviet Union all around the globe. In Africa, Angola, Ethiopia. In fact, we were fighting with the Chinese against the Soviets in Angola, right? So I do not believe in this current world, this current Cold War, if you will, that we're in, is going to lead to these proxy wars across the globe. In fact, in many ways, the U.S. and China are interested in some of the same things: stability, growth, prosperity. How they go about doing that can be very different, but the fact that they're interested in the same outcomes or similar outcomes can be juxtaposed with Russia, who in places like the African continent is more than willing to benefit from chaos. And so I think that China and the U.S. have their strategic rivalry, but it's in the Global South where there may be opportunities, maybe not for cooperation, but for deconfliction, so at least we don't come into conflicts with each other as occurred during the first Cold War. That being said, I do believe that our study of this 2007 to period to 2024 period has been under a time of China's great rise, right? We've seen the Chinese economy growing by leaps and bounds during this period. We've seen the Chinese population growing this period. We've seen Chinese going out, as the strategy says, more and more. We see China striving for achievements. And so one of the questions that kind of hangs over our conference here today is, will any of these trends continue? Right? We're looking at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences new information indicates that China's population may fall by up to 60% by the end of this century. If you have a China of 500 million people, that's a fundamentally different kind of country than a 1.4 billion, right? The Chinese economy is facing major headwinds, as many of you know, and it looks unlikely for systemic reasons that those headwinds are going to relent. So if our entire discussion is predicated on the fact that we're going to see continued Chinese growth, that would be wrong. Right? And part of our discussion here today is not only to look in the past, but also to understand what these new trends mean for China's engagement in the global South. And so I hope we can talk about this transition moment I feel that we are in right now. And there's also one other thing I kind of want to add here, and this is perhaps my own view, and I'm very interested to hear what others say throughout our conference here today. But I, in my view, see China using what I would call relatively cynical methods in order to stoke anti-American and anti-Western sentiment in the global South in ways that serve its own interests. And I wonder sometimes if this isn't an effort to, what we might call confirmation bias, right? There is a lot of residual resentment throughout the global South because of colonialism about the West. So it's easy fodder to come in and simply say the West is bad, remains bad, was bad, and is bad now. And that will serve China's interests in terms of the strategic competition with the United States. But my question for our panelists, many of which have flown in from countries all around the world, is it really serving the interests of countries in the global South to make a choice? Or are they better not served by engaging as many countries as they can and benefiting from those relationships? Is this effort to kind of split the world between more pro-China and more pro-US camps not antithetical to the interests of the global South writ large? And I don't want to necessarily say one way or the other. I'm very interested to hear from people who have come to hear their views on this. But I am concerned that we have a country in China, which is an authoritarian fascist state, which is using the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion to essentially galvanize progressives around the world behind its cause. And I find that very interesting, fascinating, and somewhat troubling that people around the world haven't recognized that this is somewhat duplicitous. So I'm very curious to hear from our many panelists about their views on this particular issue and whether they believe that China is leading these countries down the primrose path, or whether or not China is truly the leader of the global South that it portends to be. So those are a few kind of preliminary comments that I just want to put onto the table to prime our discussion. And without further ado, then, what I want to do is introduce the Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs, Dean Scott Appleby, without whom we would not be sitting here today, without whom I would not be sitting here today. Dean Appleby is a professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of 15 books. He was the founding dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs, finishing off his second term now. And the Keough School of Global Affairs, as he may tell you, only has about 8 or 9 years of history. And he has led us from our birth pangs to where we are now, which is a major college within the university. So I'm very pleased that he's come from South Bend to introduce the conference here today. And so why don't I introduce Dean Scott Appleby to the podium.
Thank you, Josh. I think with those preliminary remarks, as extensive as they were, we can adjourn the meeting now and enjoy the fall spring outside, walking around D.C. It would be a fall spring in South Bend. It might be a real spring here in D.C. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to thank the Atlantic Council for partnering with Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs on the China Global South Initiative, which seems to be a very promising and exciting project designed, as you know, to understand, analyze, and better respond to China's strategic intentions, methods, and ultimate political and economic influence in the global South. Notre Dame aspires to be a force for good in the world. It is our mantra as a university. We're force for good, although you may be more familiar with Go Irish. In order to participate in do-gooding, though, we must and do engage beyond the classroom. The China Global South Initiative partnership between the Atlantic Council and the Keough School is an example of what that engagement looks like. Over the course of the Keough School's relatively brief life, we are currently in our 9th or 10th year of existence, depending on who's counting. Since I'm the founding dean, it's the 18th or 20th year, by the way I'm counting it. We've been keeping over these 10 years, we have been keeping a pretty frenetic pace of hiring world-renowned scholars to staff our interdisciplinary research, teaching, and policy school, including Dr. Joshua Eisenman, from whom you just heard. Josh leads our discussion and collective plans to explore ever more intensively China's presence in Africa, in particular, never losing sight along the way of the domestic drivers, larger foreign policy contexts, and economic dimensions of that presence. At Notre Dame more broadly, our Asia experts from several disciplines track and evaluate the numerous ways China's role across its spheres of influence is shaping the future of its own people as well as the international order. At the Keough School itself, given the array of social scientists, legal scholars, ethicists, international conflict mediators, engineers, historians, anthropologists, and environmental governance experts that comprise our faculty, we pay particular attention to the impacts of China's policy and presences on questions raised directly to the question of integral human development and human security, including poverty, sustainability, human rights, multilateral peace building and conflict resolution, and good governance. These are the areas of expertise we have some expertise in already and are building stronger faculty every year, hiring at a pretty good clip to continue to build a faculty that now numbers about 70. Assessing China's presence in the Global South is best done in collaboration between diplomats, policymakers, China experts, and an array of related areas of specialization. That's why I join my colleagues participating in this conference, including Professors Susan Osterman and Victoria Hoy, in celebrating this partnership from which we have already learned a great deal, and by means of which we can further leverage the Keough School's and Notre Dame's growing expertise in the study of China. Last but not least, I thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this remarkable two-day conference and for taking the lead in organizing it. Among my colleagues here present is Professor Mara Policelli. There's Mara, who oversees the Keough School's Washington, D.C. office, which is just down the street. We look forward in the coming months to organizing a variety of events on China in the Global South and to hosting the next major conference of this promising partnership. Over to Dave.
Thank you, Dean Appleby. Now it is my honor to introduce General Todd D. Wolters to kick off the conference on behalf of the Atlantic Council. General Todd D. Wolters is a distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. In 2022, General Wolters completed a distinguished 40-year active duty career in the U.S. Air Force as the Supreme Allied Commander Europe and Commander of U.S. European Command. As Supreme Allied Commander Europe, he led Europe's transition out of Afghanistan, ensured the COVID-19 health crisis did not transform into a security crisis, and led NATO's military allies and partners through the organization's response to the largest invasion of a European nation since World War II. General Wolters, it's an honor to have you kick off our conference today on behalf of the Atlantic Council. Over to you.
Dave, thank you very much. And on behalf of the Atlantic Council, it's my privilege to welcome all of you for this great gathering for the China in the Global South initiative. As all of you know, it's a strategic imperative to improve global integration in the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic spectrums. And the more that we can get at this strategic integration, the greater our ability to promote our democratic values. And from a firsthand experience perspective, I was able to see the great power competition in play with respect to every single tidbit of information that came out of Moscow was instantaneously received in Iran, China, and North Korea. And that nexus reveals how fast the globe spins in the 21st century and the dramatic need that all of us have to be aware of what takes place in all dimensions across the entire globe. So on behalf of the Atlantic Council, we're very excited to have all of you for this gathering, and welcome.
All right, moving right along, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. There he is. Daniel Kritenbrink is Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, since he has been since September 2021. He's a career member of the Foreign Service at the class rank of Minister. He has served as the Senior Director for Asian Studies on the National Security Council from 2015 to 2017. And he served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Beijing, where I think we met many years ago. Back in the day, about 10 years ago now, from 2013 to 15, he has served in multiple overseas posts, as I said, in Beijing, in Tokyo, and Sapporo. He speaks Chinese and Japanese and holds a degree from the University of Virginia, a master's degree, that is. So thank you so much for joining us here today, Dr. Kritenbrink.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Joshua, for the kind introduction. Thank you to the Atlantic Council and the University of Notre Dame for inviting me to speak at this important event and for giving me an opportunity to get out of my office at the State Department. It's always a pleasure to be with you all. I'm, of course, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, honor of a lifetime to have this job. But candidly speaking, given my focus on the East Asia-Pacific region, I don't often have the opportunity to speak about countries beyond those in my region. But as Secretary Blinken has said, the People's Republic of China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, and technological capacity to do it. It's a major player on most policy issues and in most regions, and that is in part why we approach it through a global lens. The world, of course, is also more interconnected than ever. The global reverberations of the conflicts in Europe and the Middle East are a tragic reminder that what happens in one region has a direct impact on others. And of course, that is a fact that the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and Notre Dame's School of Global Affairs understands well. And it's clear looking at the panelists and the participants here today that you not only have global reach, but critically, you both are ensuring that voices from around the world are heard and amplified. As Secretary Blinken recently said, we recognize that leadership starts with listening and understanding shared problems from the perspective of others so that we can find common ground. And again, that's precisely why institutions like the Atlantic Council and Notre Dame are so important to provide a space for the exchange and free flow of ideas. And again, it's why I'm so honored to be here with you today. Let me say a little bit about the U.S. global approach. At a macro level, this notion is fundamentally what our broader U.S. foreign policy is all about, creating a world that is open, free, prosperous, and secure. A world where ideas can flow freely and individuals can say what they want, where economic partnership generates broad-based inclusive growth, and where countries can choose their own path. A world where rules, norms, and institutions prevail over outdated and dangerous concepts of might making right. This is not a world for the United States to define or advance alone. Quite the contrary. We can only build, preserve, and nurture it together with our allies, partners, and friends. And that's why our main focus, and where I spend the bulk of my time every single day, is working to cultivate and deepen our alliances and partnerships in pursuit of this affirmative vision. But of course, we can't deny that strategic competition is also a critical part of this moment. And since China, of course, is the focus of this conference, let me take just a little bit of time to explain our approach to the PRC. The PRC has itself benefited from the stability and the opportunity that the international order provides. But unfortunately, the PRC often takes actions that undermine those principles rather than reinforce them. The PRC has undermined them in the South China Sea, where it's advancing unlawful maritime claims that threaten peace and security, freedom of navigation, and commerce. Undermine them in the economic sphere, where it's imposed trade restrictions on countries that have taken sovereign decisions not to Beijing's liking. And undermine them in our own backyards, where it commits acts of transnational repression to harass, surveil, and intimidate individuals around the world, including our own citizens. In short, over the past decade, the PRC has become more repressive at home and more aggressive abroad. The PRC is advancing an alternative vision for global governance. The PRC has proposed the Global Development Initiative, the GDI, the Global Security Initiative, GSI, and the Global Civilization Initiative, GCI, as the strategic guidance for its alternative vision. And the Belt and Road Initiative is the platform for its implementation. But these initiatives represent a departure from many of the principles that lie at the heart of the international system. For example, the GSI contradicts the UN Charter by privileging the security interests of large states over smaller ones, and it delegitimizes their right to collective defense enshrined in the UN Charter. The GCI seeks to redefine human rights as unique privileges of the West, rather than inherent and universal rights that accrue to all people. And under GDI, PRC projects have often failed to meet important standards related to environmental and social protections, as well as debt sustainability. The PRC is actively seeking Global South endorsement of these initiatives to demonstrate support for its governance and development vision. Now, given our competing visions for the world, our relationship with the PRC is one of intense strategic competition. At the same time, the United States is committed to managing this competition responsibly so that it does not veer into miscalculation or conflict. And we're always willing to work with the PRC where our interests align and where there is an imperative to do so. And that's evident in our recent cooperation on transnational challenges such as climate and counter-narcotics, following the summit between President Biden and President Xi at Woodside, California. The strategy that we've put forward for our approach to the PRC challenge is what Secretary Blinken laid out in his speech nearly 2 years ago. And our paradigm is invest, align, and compete. We invest in the foundation of our strength at home, our competitiveness, our innovation, our democracy. We align our efforts with our network of allies and partners, acting with common purpose and in common cause. And harnessing these two key assets, we compete with China to defend our interests and build our vision for the future. Now, at the State Department, we primarily focus on the align and competitive pillars of our PRC strategy. So let me just share a little bit about what we've achieved in those areas. First, on align. The United States' unique comparative advantage in the world, we believe, is our extraordinary constitution of alliances and individual partnerships. In the past 3 years, we've been renewing, rejuvenating, and even reimagining them. That's evident through the traditional alliances and partnerships, again, that we have re-energized. For example, the leaders of the Quad countries, which include, of course, India, Australia, and Japan, have met 5 times since March 2021 and put forward major initiatives on infrastructure, maritime security, public-private partnerships, climate health, critical and emerging technologies, and space. Similarly, in 2022, after welcoming the leaders of ASEAN to Washington for an historic U.S.-ASEAN Special Summit, we upgraded our partnership with ASEAN to a comprehensive strategic partnership. And we've even opened a U.S.-ASEAN Center right here in D.C. In partnership with Arizona State University. We've also launched new ASEAN-focused cabinet-level engagement in health, climate, in the environment, energy, transportation, and women's empowerment. And we've sustained top-level participation in long-standing dialogue tracks with ASEAN with the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the U.S. Trade Representative. Our approach is also evident in the new collection of countries with which we're partnering, even as we engage with multilateral groupings that are fit for purpose. For example, last September, we launched the Partnership for Atlantic Cooperation on the Margins of UNGA, which is a new multilateral forum that brings together 32 coastal Atlantic countries across 4 continents to address a broad range of issues from economic development to environmental protection to science and technology. After organizing the first Summit for Democracy in December 2021, we've partnered with over 100 governments around the world to take meaningful steps to build more resilient democracies, combat corruption, and defend human rights. Last year, we co-hosted the second Summit for Democracy with the leaders of Costa Rica, the Netherlands, the Republic of Korea, and the Republic of Zambia. And this diverse group of co-hosts underscores the universal desire for accountable, transparent, and rights-respecting governance. And we very much look forward to Seoul's hosting the next Summit for Democracy. In September 2023, for the second year in a row, President Biden hosted the leaders of the Pacific Islands for a U.S. Pacific Islands Summit. And building upon the historic first Pacific Islands Summit in 2022, the President reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to our shared regional priorities and to deepening our cooperation around them, including tackling the climate crisis, advancing economic growth, promoting sustainable development, strengthening health security, countering illegal unreported fishing, and expanding our people-to-people ties. In other words, I think that this summit with the Pacific Island leaders represented what American foreign policy is all about, meeting our partners where they live, understanding what their top needs and priorities are, and then working together to address them. That is our affirmative vision. And finally, our commitment to engaging partners is evident as we deepen our bilateral relationships with the countries, institutions, and people of emerging partner economies, or what the Atlantic Council, of course, refers to as the Global South. I know there's a lot of controversy around that term, but you've used it, so let's go with it. During historic leader level visits in 2023, we upgraded our bilateral relationships with Vietnam and Indonesia to comprehensive strategic partnerships. In December 2022, we hosted the second U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, which included delegations from all 49 invited African countries and the African Union, alongside members of civil society and the private sector. Building on this historic summit, 17 cabinet and U.S. government leaders visited 26 countries in Africa in 2023. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, in my area of responsibility, we've recently opened embassies in the Solomon Islands and Tonga. We intend to open an embassy imminently in Vanuatu, and we're actively discussing our interest in opening an embassy with the government of Kiribati. We've also opened a new U.S. embassy in the Maldives, and we've recognized the Cook Islands and Niue as sovereign and independent nations and established diplomatic relations with them. But it's not enough to just show up. It's not enough to just hold conferences and summits. It's about delivering. As Secretary Blinken often says, we don't want countries to have to choose between us and the PRC, but we want to help ensure that they have a choice and that they can make their decisions free from coercion. That brings me to the compete pillar of our China strategy. We're competing with the PRC to offer a better value proposition to developing countries. One, again, that is in line with their interests and values and supports their ability to make their own sovereign decisions, again, free from coercion. At last year's UNGA meetings, for example, we reaffirmed our commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals in recognition that when countries come together under a common development vision, then they have the capacity to deliver for both people and the planet. As a longstanding leader on global development, the U.S. remains the single largest bilateral donor, investing over $100 billion in ODA over the last 2 years alone. This includes over $43 billion to help end poverty, SDG 1, over $20 billion to drive inclusive economic growth and decent work, which is SDG 8, and over $16 billion to promote peace, justice, and good governance, which is SDG 16. The U.S. is also the largest provider of humanitarian aid at a time of unprecedented need, including in Gaza, where Secretary Blinken, of course, has visited the region 5 times since the conflict began in October, and where we have ensured the delivery of aid to address the ongoing suffering of Palestinian civilians. Since January 2021, the U.S. has provided $17.5 billion to tackle global hunger, and we provide more than 50% of the World Food Programme's budget. We're devoting $1 billion annually through Feed the Future, which is the U.S. government's global food security initiative to strengthen food systems, social safety nets, and nutrition in more than 40 countries. We're also strengthening food systems over the long term through initiatives like the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, or VACS. This was launched in partnership with the African Union and the FAO, and VACS is now mobilizing the international community to boost agricultural productivity and nutrition by investing more in expanding access to diverse, climate-adapted crops and building fertile, healthy soils. We've directed $150 million in support for the vision, and we rallied a broad coalition of governments, corporations, and nonprofits to work alongside us in support of these goals. We are closing the infrastructure gap in developing countries through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or PGI, catalyzing investments in values-driven, high-impact, and quality infrastructure and related investments. And we, along with our G7 partners, have already mobilized more than $30 billion towards a collective commitment of $600 billion in infrastructure financing by 2027. Through PGI, we, in partnership with the European Union, are making a series of transformative investments in the Lobito Economic Corridor, which is a band of development connecting Africa from Angola's port of Lobito across the DRC and Zambia, with port upgrades, new and upgraded rail lines, bridges and roads, new green power projects, 4G and 5G access through trusted vendors and agribusiness development, among a multitude of other projects. PGI announced projects to date that will deliver 500 megawatts of power to Angola, enough to provide electricity for more than 1 million people, cut around 900,000 tons of carbon emission every year, create thousands of jobs for Africans, thousands more for Americans, and bring critical minerals like copper and cobalt to global markets to support the clean energy transition. We've also recently launched the landmark India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC. Together with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, France, Germany, Italy, and the EU, we are layering transformative investments across multiple sectors to leverage broader effects of boosting economic development, securing supply chains, and bolstering regional connectivity. IMEC has the potential to usher in a new era of connectivity from Europe to Asia, with a railway linked through ports connected by the Middle East. This will create novel interconnections to facilitate global trade, expand reliable access to electricity, facilitate clean energy distribution, and strengthen telecommunications links. We're also forging and nurturing partnerships to leverage public finance to achieve climate action. For example, we're engaged in just energy transition partnerships, or JETPs, with South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam to accelerate their ambitious energy transitions, strengthen the policy and regulatory environment for clean energy investment, and build a pipeline of clean energy projects. We co-lead the International Partners Group, the IPG, for the Indonesia JETP with Japan, and we worked with our JETP partners and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero to mobilize over $20 billion in public and private financing. And we're working with our IPG partners to mobilize $15.5 billion and $8.5 billion in public and private financing for Vietnam and South Africa, respectively. So part and parcel of delivering on our promises, though, is also ensuring that we are seeking to deliver for those to have a seat at the table when we're making decisions that impact them. That's why Secretary Blinken has said our goal is not just to preserve the international order, but also to modernize it and ensure it represents the interests of all nations so that it can address new global challenges, whether it's climate change or global pandemics like COVID-19. That's why we also support increasing the number of both permanent and non-permanent representatives at the UN Security Council. This includes permanent seats for those nations that we've long supported and permanent seats for countries in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. It's also why we supported the African Union's bid to join the G20, a reflection about the G20's vitality and the important role of Africa in the global economy. And it's why we support a proposed deputy managing director role and executive board chair for sub-Saharan Africa at the IMF to give greater voice to the global South. So in conclusion, in outlining this incredibly long list of policies and initiatives, I hope it's clear that while we're in the midst of intense strategic competition to shape the future of the international order, we also refuse to see the world solely through those terms. Indeed, we engage all regions and all nations across all of these issues, not in terms of what we are against, but in terms of what we are for. And what we are for is a free, open, prosperous, and secure international order. And we draw strength knowing that what we are for is a goal shared across geographies and people. We are for an order that allows individuals to enjoy their basic universal rights and freedoms, that provides all nations that sign up to these principles an opportunity to participate in and have a role in shaping these rules. that empowers all nations to continually raise the standard of living for their citizens, and one that is free from aggression, coercion, and intimidation. That is our vision for the international order. We will continue building the strongest possible coalition of nations to advance this vision and to improve the lives of the American people and peoples around the world. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to share our views, and I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have about a 10-minute break here. We're going to reconvene at 9:35 for our first panel with Dave as the moderator.